Ja, Willie Soon, unser alter Freund, ist jetzt dran. Ich will gar nichts weiter sagen. Ich freue mich sehr, dass er da ist.
Alright, thank you. 早安，大家好，我叫孙伟叔父，谢谢大家来这边听我讲座。Just a joke with the translator there. Let's give them a round of applause, right? They've been working hard for the last. All right, indeed. Good morning. Of course, English is my native language, so what can I do? It is an honor to be speaking at EIKE conference again. My name is indeed Willie Soon, and the title of my talk today is From Demon to Dinner, the scientific case for both CO₂ and fossil fuel. I want to first thank my colleague Jonathan Kohler for sharing with you some of the exciting new work and progress we have made on global carbon budget in his talk last night. I also want to thank Professor Dimitris Kosoyanis of Athens for his general help in looking over my slide for this talk. Of course, all responsibility and faults are mine. Finally, I want to thank Dr. Ronan Connolly, who is still not here yet, for his excellent talk yesterday morning, and at CERES, for his excellent talk introducing our work at CERES, Center for Environmental Research and Earth Sciences, especially the donation part, don't forget. Like Ronan, I want to dedicate this talk to the memory of Dr. Michael Connolly, our late colleague and teacher, and Ronan's father. Let me begin with a legal absurdity. In the United States, carbon dioxide, or CO₂, is officially classified as an air pollutant. This came out of the US Supreme Court case of Massachusetts versus EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, in April 2007. Justice Anthony Scalia, in dissent, captured the absurdity perfectly. He wrote that under the majority's reading, all airborne compounds qualify as pollutants. Everything airborne from frisbee to flatulence, or as we say in Germany, die Blähung. He said it plainly. This morning, this reading of the statute defies common sense. And yet, that absurd reading is now the law of the land in the United States. Justice Samuel Alito explained the science correctly. A pollutant is a substance harmful to humans, animals, or plants. Carbon dioxide is not harmful to ordinary things. It is needed for plant growth. Every one of us in this room is exhaling carbon dioxide right now. If CO₂ is a pollutant, then we are all polluters, every breathing creatures on earth. This is a saying that I love. To call CO₂ a pollutant is a corruption of the English language. Plants do not call it a pollutant, they call it dinner. Well, this statement actually captured the essence of my talk today. We are going to fully address CO₂ scientifically from demon to dinner in this talk. CO₂ is the gas of life. Without it, the biosphere collapses completely. Below about 150 parts per million, or ppm, photosynthesis fails and most plants die. We're currently at around 425 ppm. From a biospheric point of view, we have only recently escaped a CO₂ starvation regime. Now look at this chart from Alex Epstein. As the fossil fuel rose, extreme poverty fell. This is not a small correlation. Over the past 200 years, more than 1 billion human beings have been lifted out of grinding poverty. And the engine that did it was cheap, dense, reliable energy from coal, oil, and natural gas. And here's the corollary, courtesy of Joe Nova of Australia. Richer is cleaner. Wealthy nations have cleaner air, cleaner water, more forest cover, and better public health. The best thing we can do for the global environment is to help poor nations grow their economies. The worst thing we can do, and indeed this is exactly what international climate policy is doing right now, is push unreliable energy onto developing world and deprive them of using fossil fuels, especially coal power plants, in the name of the environment. The science perspective on this issue is rising. Slowly, but it is indeed rising. Here's the open secret of energy. Every successful energy transition in human history has gone from lower energy density to higher energy density. First wood, then coal, then oil, then uranium, natural gas, and then uranium. Each step gives us more energy per kilogram, more energy per square meter. Professor Colin McInnes of the University of Glasgow put it well. An energy transition that leads to more expensive and less efficient energy is not a revolution. It is a regression. And that is exactly what 100% renewable represent, a return to the energy dark ages. The world has spent 200 years successfully running from diffuse intermittent biomass and weather-dependent power. Now we are told to run back to the energy dark ages. By 2400 AD, perhaps humanity may achieve 100% renewable again, by which time the light will have gone out several times, and how many people will die because of such extreme delusion on fake renewable energy or fake energy. Well, if you really think fossil fuels are bad, just ask yourself, do you prefer whale oil instead? Before kerosene, North Atlantic whale were hunted nearly to extinction to light the lamps of Europe and America. Fossil fuels saved the whales. Or perhaps you prefer the great horse manure crisis of 1894. In New York City around 1900, a population of 100,000 working horses produced 2.5 million pounds of manure every single day. The Times of London predicted that by 1950, every street in the city would be buried under 9 feet of manure, or 2 meters or so, or a little more. The internal combustion engine solved that problem. Fossil fuels saved the city again. And then there is nuclear power.
Ach so, es ist ja...
Last October, Germany blew up the cooling towers of yet another decommissioned nuclear plant in Bavaria. Functioning, paid for, carbon-free baseload power reduced to rubble. Deliberately destroy. This is not energy policy. This is energy vandalism. Well, even Chancellor Merz has publicly admitted what every honest engineer knew the whole time. In January of this year, he said, and I quote, "It was a serious strategic mistake to phase out nuclear energy. We are now undertaking the most expensive energy transition in the entire world." That admission is welcome, but it is also far too late. The consequences are clear and serious, if not deadly. Look at this chart on industrial production growth that was circulated 2 weeks ago. Switzerland versus Germany. Same continent, same century, similar weather. Switzerland kept its nuclear plants. Germany shut them down and built massive wind and solar. The result? Switzerland has cheaper, more reliable, and lower emission electricity. Germany has the most expensive electricity in the industrialized world and is burning more lignite coal. As the chart asks, if cheap wind and solar plus nuclear shutdown is such a good idea, how did this great divergence between Germany and Switzerland happen? Well, the answer is that climate policy is no longer about climate. It is about taxation and control. We have reached a point where government tax the air you breathe and expect you to say thank you. Professor Michael Hart of Canada says it best. I want to read it very slowly because every word matters here. Politicians are throwing money that they do not have at a problem that does not exist in order to finance a solution that makes no difference. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the climate policy of the Western world in a single sentence. Now let me introduce you to a new English word, climitard for climate retard. I hope this is not too rude, but this word accurately refers to a person that actually believes the climate can be changed by paying a CO₂ tax to the government. Next, we ask, what are the CO₂ emissions from all human activity actually doing? Here are US emissions from fossil fuel use since 1970 to about 2005, rising as everyone expects. But look at what has happened since then. United States CO₂ emissions are now 20% below the 2005 peak. 20%. With no Paris Agreement, no carbon tax, no central planning, the combination of natural gas displacing coal, more efficient energy, and a maturing economy that did it. Now, Germany, here's German CO₂ emission from 1792 to 1979. You know a reason why I stopped there, right? Almost 2 centuries of industrialization, rising steadily. And here's the full record through 2024. German emissions today are 49% below their 1979's peak. Here's another truly remarkable facts and statistics. Germany in 2024 contribute less CO₂ to the world than Germany did in 1792. Less at the dawn of the steam age, yet German citizens are told they must pay more, use less fossil fuel, freeze more, travel less, because their emissions are destroying the planet. The data really says otherwise. Global emission, what about the world's CO₂ emission then? China has flat or falling CO₂ emission for 21 consecutive months. 21 months of stall growth or decline. Do you know about these latest statistics? Here's another big surprise. Global CO₂ emissions have been essentially flat for more than 1 decade, 10 years. The climate activist Ziggy Hausfather himself published this 2 weeks ago. Plateau for over 10 years. How many of you know of this fact? So if all global human emissions have been flat for more than 10 years, what is happening to atmospheric CO₂? It continues to rise smoothly, monotonically, as if it had not even noticed that human emissions stopped accelerating. That single fact, flat emission rising carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, should have ended the conversation. If the rise were driven by the emission, this rise rate would slow than when emission plateau. It does not. So what is driving CO₂ level in the atmosphere? To answer that question, I want to walk you through some recent work. First, by my friend Dimitri Kosoanis of the National Technical University of Athens, a hydrologist, and then an extension that Jonathan Kohler discussed in his excellent talk last night. Start with a very simple number that IPCC never highlights. Every year, more than 200 gigatons of carbon move out of the atmosphere into the ocean and the biosphere. The atmosphere holds about 750 to 900 gigatons total. That means over 20% of the atmosphere carbon is flushed out and replaced every single year. Stop and think about that. Every 4 years or so, the entire atmospheric carbon inventory turns over. I hope you know by now it's not 10,000 years, right? Every 4 years. Ask yourself, in a system that completely turns over its carbon every 4 years, how can a 1% annual perturbation from fossil fuel dominate the trend? It cannot. Unless you assume without evidence that nature is in perfect static balance and only humans push it. That is the IPCC hidden assumption. You strip it out, the attribution collapses. The natural fluxes are so much larger than the human flux that a small natural imbalance, a 1 to 2%, shift in the equilibrium between sources and sink entirely overwhelm anything we do. Now let's look at the seasonal cycle of CO₂. Here's what those records look like at Mauna Loa, Hawaii, and at Barrow, Alaska. Smooth rising with seasonal teeth on top. The atmosphere breathes. Each northern hemisphere, spring and summer, CO₂ falls by several ppm as forests lift out. Every fall and winter, it rises again. That is the biosphere inhaling and exhaling on a planetary scale. Entirely natural. Now compare Mauna Loa to the South Pole. At Mauna Loa, the seasonal amplitude is around 6 ppm. At the South Pole, it is only 1. The seasonal swings follow the biosphere, not the distribution of fossil fuel emission. If fossil fuel control the rise, they would also control the seasonal cycle. They do not. Terence Jack Blasing and colleagues at Oak Ridge National Lab spelled it out in 2005 in the journal Tellus. I quote, "It is clear that cycle of fossil fuel use is not responsible for the annual cycle of CO₂ concentration in the air. The annual global total of fossil fuel input is much less than the magnitude of the annual fluctuation. The biosphere is the only known influence large enough to account for the observed increase in annual amplitude of atmospheric CO₂ concentration. This paper has been essentially ignored for 20 years, but the math has not changed. The annual cycle of amplitude of US fossil fuel emission is only 20 teragram of carbon. For the whole world, it's only 70 to 100 teragram. That is the entire seasonal modulation of human emission. But the measured atmospheric amplitude, 5 ppm, correspond to about 10,000 teragram of carbon, 100 times bigger than the human seasonal cycle. As Dimitri put it to me in May in private correspondence, if the IPCC narrative were correct, they ought to be able to explain the maximum variability, including the 15 to 20 ppm swings at Barrow, not just an arbitrary global average. They cannot. Now the defender of the IPCC will concede that seasonal cycle is natural. It has to be, the math is obvious. But they argue then, yes, the seasonal part is natural, but the long-term trend is human. Let us look at them. Here's a recent report by Engelbein, Hannon, and Burton from December 2024. They write, and I quote, that multiple lines of scientific evidence, reminders of IPCC language, demonstrate conclusively that modern rise in CO₂ is mainly due to anthropogenic emission. They list 4 lines of evidence: mass balance, delta 13C isotopes, slight reduction in atmospheric oxygen, and ocean acidification. They believe this clinch the case. We humbly disagree with EHB conclusion. Let me explain why, starting with the delta 13C argument, because that's the one most often cited. This is Francie and colleague from Australia, published in the journal Tellus, 1999. Atmospheric delta 13C has indeed been declining since the last 2 to 3 centuries, from about -6.5 per mil to -8. Fossil fuel are isotopically light, so it must be fossil fuel 13, right? It must be fossil fuel, right? No, wrong. Dimitri has shown, but some even refuse to even ask those critical questions in his presentation at Clintel workshop in Athens in September of 2024 and at the Hungarian Academy of Science in December 2025 recently, that the delta 13C decline is fully consistent with a natural shift in the balance between ocean and biosphere fluxes. The isotopic signature of the biosphere is also light. C3 plants runs -22 to -37 per mil. Decaying vegetation, soil, peatland fires, forest fire, all release isotopically light carbon. You cannot tell the difference between CO₂ emission from coal, gasoline, natural gas, and a hamburger using the delta-13C isotope alone. The delta-13C isotope data from Jahren and Kraft in 2009 published in the PNAS, Proceeding of the National Academy of Science, confirmed this important point. The point is that using IPCC's deduction method, perhaps it is your hamburger that caused a slight decrease in delta-13C value in the last 100 to 200 years or so. And there is direct paleo evidence. Delta Loranto and colleagues, 2010, the ice core record showed large swing in atmospheric delta-13C before any fossil fuel burning. Natural shift in sources and sink moved delta-13C around. The current decline is not unique to the industrial era. Jochen Schmidt and colleagues in Science, 2012, same story. Large pre-industrial delta-13C variation driven by ocean biosphere rearrangement. So delta-13C smoking gun turns out to be a fingerprint shared by natural sources and sink. Dimitri asked a very simple question. Why would anyone think that atmospheric CO2 and the increase for the past 60 to 80 years cannot be largely natural? Just check out the soil temperature relation and look at the photo of the trees in two extreme seasons. Dimitri challenges those who deny the dominant natural sources and sink of CO2 to simply look. Here are some numbers from Dimitri's mass balance model. One can see that the net inflow seasonal variation ranges from 130 ppm per year in the 1960s and grown and elevated to 240 ppm level today. This is simply the expansion of the biosphere. And of course, human seasonal factor is actually minuscule. And here's the punchline of his analysis. Two scenarios, first shown without human emission. The second one shown with human emission. Can you tell the difference? The natural reservoir exchanges are so large that human emissions are within the noise. They do not produce a statistically distinguishable signal in the atmospheric record on timescale analyzed. Now, to the extension Jonathan and I have just done in our 2026 paper currently in preparation. We estimate that the biosphere has gained around 55.3 gigatons of carbon between 1961 and 2023. That's 62 years of data, okay, roughly 0.9 gigaton per year on average, with an increasing trend towards the present. The land biosphere is not a passive victim of CO2. It is a growing pool of carbon sources and sink. Every year, the planet vegetation absorbs and emits more carbon than it did a year before. The rate is rising as CO2 rises. It is exactly what the greenhouse experiment since the 1960s predicted. It is exactly what we now observe at global scale. This single result has profound implication. The ever-expanding biosphere is promoting and stimulating life, not destroying the planet Earth. It does so silently, without subsidy, without conferences, and without United Nations resolution. And now for something striking. Our estimate roughly matches what Hui Yang and colleagues published recently in Nature Geoscience in 2023. Independent method, similar answer. The land sources and sinks are real, large, and growing. Our 55.3 gigaton over 62 years from 1961 to 2023 is fully consistent with their work. The biosphere is responding to CO2 exactly the real world is saying, growing by about 0.9 gigaton per year. So, the modern carbon cycle is dominated by natural fluxes. Now, let us look at out-of-sample testing. If natural fluxes can drive CO2 today, they must have driven it in the past. Is there evidence of high CO2 level in recent paleo climate record? Yes, the scientific discussion has been politely forgotten. Here's a quote from a long-forgotten estimate from ocean sediment core when studying CO2 is not a political science. During the last interglacial, stage 5E, roughly 130 to 120,000 years ago, Atmospheric CO₂ was higher than the pre-anthropogenic Holocene level, higher than the pre-industrial baseline of 280 ppm that the IPCC treat as sacred. The ocean sediment core and ice core record are not the only paleoclimate archive. Plant stomata, tiny pores on leaf, respond inversely to atmospheric CO₂. Western hemlock gives us a stomata density record that's arguably more reliable than air bubbles in ice core, which are subject to diffusion, brine pocket, and post-depositional alteration. And here's what the stomata data say. The IPCC tells us that CO₂ level was flat at 280 ppm for the entire Holocene. The stomata data record says natural variation of 50 to 100 ppm on multi-decadal to centennial timescale. The ice core data shows a hockey stick because diffusion in the front smoother high-frequency multi-decadal to centennial variability. The stomata can see what the ice cannot. Can you see the shape of the stomata CO₂ curve? Look more like a bathtub than a hockey stick. Even Naftel and colleagues in their landmark 1982 Nature paper from Camp Century, Greenland, reported elevated CO₂ in the air 1,000 to 2,000 years ago. These values are similar to what were deduced from the stomata data by Cohenberg and colleagues. That old ice record has been quietly hidden for 45 years. So if CO₂ is rising naturally and human emissions are flat, and the biosphere is fully dynamic and growing, then perhaps the joke is on those who build their careers on the opposite assumptions and refuse debate, obviously. But isn't rising carbon dioxide causing global boiling? And I'm here quoting the Secretary General of the United Nations here. Surely the atmosphere knows that we humans are emitting. Let us look to see if the actual data is suggesting global boiling. Let's hear it from Charles David Keeling himself. Yes, the Keeling of the Keeling curve. He gave his Tyler Prize lecture in 2005. He criticized the IPCC third assessment report reliance on Michael Mann's hockey stick temperature curve. Note that Michael Mann is the 2019 Tyler Prize recipient. Keeling called the picture embarrassing. He said, and I quote, that it certainly casts doubt that the greenhouse effect is responsible for all the warming. That statement came from David Keeling himself, not from a skeptic, from the man whose name is on the canonical CO₂ record. Let's hear what he has to say in this video. It's maybe less than a minute.
So now let's try something in which we are innovating compared with the meteorologists are doing. We use something we call a spline fit because the irregularity of the CO₂ record doesn't really allow to do a careful spectral analysis where you have oscillatory behavior that's fixed in its phasing and amplitude. So here's a fit through the data of the temperature. And this is an embarrassing picture because there are people, including those who reported to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Program for Climate Change, in their third assessment, on what's been called the hockey stick, in which they said temperature has been pretty much constant until just recently when it zoomed up. But what's going on here? Here's the 1920s, and here it's happening again, and here's a period in between. It certainly casts doubt that the greenhouse effect is responsible for all the warming, because it can't possibly be responsible in the same way for these two warming events.
You know what? Someone should tell Michael Mann that Charles David Keeling did not agree with the hockey stick temperature history. I can easily predict that Mann will soon label Dr. Keeling a climate change denier. By the way, Mann's middle name is E, and my good friend David Legates likes to suggest that E stands for Einstein, because he was paid by the fossil fuel oil, fossil fuel and fossil fuel company. Here's another humbling picture, adapted from Carlson, Lassis, and colleagues from NASA GIS in 2019. The energy flows from the sun is enormous. The radiative perturbation from 150 years of added CO2, regardless of the cause, since 1850 is small line on the side of this diagram. Hunting for CO2 in the climate system is like hunting for a candle in a World Cup football stadium under flight light. The number makes it obvious. The sun's total power is 4 times 10 to the 26 watt. The earth intercepts only 2 times 10 to the 17 watt. The earth's own internal radiogenic heat is only 2 times 10 to the power of 13 watt. Therefore, the earth is 2 billion times weaker than the sun. The weather climate system on earth is powered entirely by solar energy, if not your hair. CO2 does not generate energy. It only modulates how energy moves through the atmospheric column. And as we will see, that modulation is small. How small are the climatic effects of CO2? Let us do a simple, transparent calculation right here for Germany. The seasonal temperature in Germany, winter to summer, is roughly 26 degrees Celsius. The corresponding seasonal changes in solar radiation reaching the surface is about 205 watt per meter square peak to peak. Winter at 20 to 40 watt per meter square, summer at 220 to 250. A swing of about 205 watt per meter square. So nature itself can tell us the sensitivity of German surface temperature to radiative forcing. 26 degrees Celsius divided by 205 multiplied by IPCC claim forcing for doubling CO2, about 3.8 watt per meter square, give roughly 0.48 degree for a doubling of CO2. Half a degree, not 3, not 6, not global boiling. Even if we are conservative and use seasonal amplitude of 110 watt per meter square instead of the full peak-to-peak swing, we get about 0.9 degree per doubling. Still well under 1. That is the empirical climate sensitivity. Measured on the ground in Germany using seasonal cycle as nature's own forcing experiment. There are no general circulation model in this calculation, no tuned parameterization, no flux correction, just measure solar irradiance, measure surface temperature, and a stated IPCC forcing value. The IPCC central estimate of 3 degrees is at least 3 times too high or possibly 6 times too high. So, if CO2 does not actively control the flow of energy, what does it do? It feeds life. That's what it does. For the biosphere, CO2 is the gas of life. Every carbohydrate, every protein, every cellulose fiber on this planet was once a CO2 molecule. We are CO2, chemically reorganized. CO2 is not a pollutant. Humans are breathing, giving out CO2 at 40,000 ppm or 4% level, roughly 100 times more concentrated than in the free air. The ITSO family at the Center for Study of CO2 and Global Change has documented for decades that pre-industrial CO2 plants of 280 ppm represent starvation condition for most C3 plants. From a plant's perspective, the rise to 425 ppm is not a crisis. It is a long overdue dinner, so they're very hungry. And here's a genuine good news in recent literature. Gui, Wang, and colleagues, Nature Review for Earth and Environment, April 2025, published in one of the most prestigious journals in earth sciences. The headline finding, the planet is now greener than at least 25 years ago. A total of 68% of vegetated land has been greening. Rising CO2 is producing measurable global benefit in plant productivity, water use efficiency, and crop yields. Even a journal as institutionally aligned as Nature Review could not avoid publishing the results. NASA confirmed the global greening in 2019. Satellite shows that the Earth has been greener over the past 3 decades. And the greening is dominated by China and India, the 2 countries among the largest CO2 emission, including US. The biosphere is responding exactly as plant physiology predicts. China's Los Potos, historically one of the most degraded landscapes on Earth, has been transformed. 1999 at the top and 2018 at the bottom. From bare ochre soil to dense green cover, CO₂ fertilization plus active land management plus warmer growing season is good for the planet. And here's the mechanism. More CO₂ means plants can keep their stomata partially closed while still absorbing enough carbon. Closed stomata means less water loss, so rising CO₂ make plants more drought tolerant. This is fundamental plant biology. It has been demonstrated in greenhouse experiments since the 1980s and in free air CO₂ enrichment experiment, FACE phase, since 1990s. You can see it in the leaf stomata themselves. As CO₂ rise, stomata densities fall. The plants literally re-engineer their plumbing to be more efficient. Less water is needed. Higher productivity for a drop of rains. Even the cartoonists have noticed too. The greening of the planet is so visible from space that the only response from the climate activists has been to find ways to call it bad. So, desert getting green is bad. The latest campaign, and I'm not making this up, is that greener is somehow now a problem. The greening of Earth is being recast as danger. From time to time, we are also being told that global warming by CO₂ is causing famines. But this is a joke, right? Global crop yield hitting record after record, cereal production rising in every major producing region year after year. Here's an actual peer-reviewed answer. Lin and Jahren published 3 weeks ago. The contribution of rising CO₂ in doubling global rice production over recent decades is 30%. 30% of the doubling of rice yield is directly attributable to CO₂ fertilization. We are feeding billions of additional people in parts because of fossil fuel. Both the CO₂ and the fertilizer and the diesel-powered tractor and irrigation pump. Richard Lindzen and Will Harper is sitting in the room, two of the most distinguished atmospheric physicists alive, wrote last year that doubling CO₂ from today 420 ppm to 840 ppm would increase food available worldwide by roughly 40%. And the effect on temperature, they note, would be negligible. 40% more food, negligible warming, that is the real deal planet Earth is in for. So this cartoon is telling us the sad state of climate science that is now actively denying that the planet is indeed getting greener. Beneficial effects are also involving forests too. More CO₂, more wood production. Richard Norby of Oak Ridge National Lab published a synthesis last year in New Phytologist of 6 free air CO₂ enrichment experiments. With CO₂ enrichment of 41%, comparable to where we may be heading, net primary productivity rose by 22%. Wood production rose by 18%. These are not models. These are actual field measurement and experiment. And in Amazonia, the largest tropical forest on Earth, Escovel and Mulbeck and colleagues showed earlier this year that trees have been growing bigger by 3.3% per decade or for at least 30 years. The Amazonian forest is gaining biomass. The rainforest is thriving under elevated CO₂. So can you blame the blogger Lucy Bigger for asking this seemingly naive question? If you were to ask a tree, not Al Gore of course, if it wanted 430 ppm or 800 ppm, what would the answer be? It's not rhetorical. Well, Earth is not only gas on life on land. What about the ocean? Zhao, Maniza, and colleagues published this important paper in Science last year. Subpolar and polar ocean of the northern hemisphere are greener than they were 3 decades ago. More phytoplankton, more primary production, more carbon drawdown by marine biology, the ocean is responding to. Even NOAA is bringing us good news. NOAA, not an institution given to optimism on this question, published in last December's Arctic report card that the Arctic is greening on both land and the ocean. Tundra is gaining vegetation, Arctic seas are gaining productivity, plankton and phytoplankton activities and productivity are all increasing. What is not to like? Finally, and this fact may surprise most, including even me actually before I researched into this issue carefully, CO2 has several direct medical applications that were well established in the peer-reviewed literature. Two I will mention briefly: healing wounds and, astonishingly, killing cancer cell and shrinking tumor. CO2 therapy is known to be able to reduce migraine, but we will not discuss it here. Makura and colleague reported in International Wound Journal 2020 about how transcutaneous CO2 therapy can accelerate wound closure. I guess I should warn you, the picture can look horrible, but take a look. The before and after image are striking. Chronic non-healing wound resolving over weeks of CO2 treatment. Here's another great result that proved the beneficial use of CO2 for wound healing. And the most remarkable result by Yu-Iha and colleagues in Oncology Report 2017. CO2 gas absorbed through skin killed cancer cell and shrank tumor in mice with 3 different human cancer: breast cancer, osteosarcoma, and undifferentiated pleomorphic sarcoma. Significant cell death only after 10 minutes of application. Tumor size shrinks significantly after 5 minutes. This is the molecule that the United States Environmental Protection Agency, US EPA, declared a pollutant. Let me now summarize what we have covered today using this quote from Professor Richard Lindzen. What historians will definitely wonder about in future centuries is how deeply flawed logic, obscured by shrewd and unrelenting propaganda, actually enable a coalition of powerful special interests to convince everyone in the world that CO2, nearly everyone, in the CO2 from human activity was a dangerous planet-destroying toxin. It will be remembered as the greatest mass delusion in the history of the world that CO2, the life of plant, was considered at time a deadly poison. CO2 is not a pollutant, nor a toxin, nor a poison. As Professor Lindzen put it, it is the molecular foundation of the biosphere. Calling it a pollutant is, as the saying goes, a corruption of the English language. Folks producing the UN IPCC report are suffering a serious mass delusion about the extreme danger of CO2, despite it being a gas of life itself. Human CO2 emissions have plateaued, flattened for more than a decade. In the United States, in Germany, in China, and globally. The data are clear. They came from sources sympathetic to the IPCC's political consensus. The world is not in an emission emergency. The continued rise of CO2 is dominated by natural fluxes. The atmosphere turns over its entire carbon inventory every 4 years. A small natural imbalance in the equilibrium between ocean, biosphere, and atmosphere is more than sufficient to explain the observed trend. Dimitri Kosoyanis has shown that temperature CO2 causality run from warming to outgassing on every timescale he has tested. The biosphere is gaining roughly 0.9 gigaton of carbon per year, 55.3 gigaton over the last 62 years, and the rate may be even accelerating. This is a thriving, growing source and sink, not a saturating one. The greening of the earth is visible from space, and the benefits are real. 40% more food at double CO2, 30% of the rice yields doubling attributed to CO2 fertilization. Greener forests, greener ocean, greener Arctic, wound that heal, tumor that shrink. We have studied CO2 scientifically from demon to dinner. The biosphere knew it all along. The plant knew it. The whale whose oil we no longer need knew it. The horse manure we no longer shovel knew it. The billion people lifted from extreme poverty knows it. The world government policy has not yet caught up. That is our task, yours and mine, going forward, to insist that policy be grounded in measurement, in physics, in honesty about what we know and what we do not know. To refuse the politicization and demonization of a molecule, and to keep saying it as clearly and as often as it takes, that CO2 is not a satanic gas, nor a demon. It is simply dinner. Thank you very much.